Everything I owned was in that house. I lost my wife about a year ago. And so there was a lot of emotion and a lot of memories that I have to not think about.
As we were driving into the neighborhood, Lily kept saying, it feels so weird to be here. And we were just trying to kind of prepare her that it's going to look a lot different.
And it looks like it's a huge, stupid beach. It's usually like there's so much grass, all the kids running around. It just feels weird seeing it like this because all this trash is never here. It was like so high and scary. Like first the water was up to here, then it started getting into the houses. See this like post-it note thing? My mom told me it was like, make sure there's no dead bodies.
He has been so obsessed with looking through flooding pictures. At least 5 times a day, he wants to look and see the house when it first flooded.
Lily's school flooded than you.
And the picture of Lily's school.
So the grant is a max of $33,300, and you can only get that once you've been inspected. We have almost 800,000 registrations in the state of Texas alone. Right now it's just a waiting process because it does take a while for them to get to you.
So what's going to happen is, don't freak out. You're going to get a denial letter from FEMA because you had a homeowners. But when you get your reward letter from your homeowners, tell them how much they're paying you, you're going to bring a copy of that letter to me, and I'm going to fax it to Washington, and then FEMA picks back up what the homeowners didn't pay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but then, okay.
Okay?
Now what do I do for wheels?
That, I don't know.
I mean, you're
reactions or thoughts you want to share in response to that video? Okay, with that, I'm going to invite Grover Fugate, the Executive Director of the Coastal Resources Management Council, to introduce what we're doing tonight. Thank you, Grover.
Okay. I'm afraid to get this thing too close to me. Can everybody hear? So one of the reasons we wanted to show that tonight is it's sort of a sad reality that we tend to rely on a lot of government organizations to protect us, and oftentimes they don't reveal the risk that's out there. The BeachSAMP is a Coastal Resources Management Council, and by the way, we have two council members here, Don Gomez, who's on the BeachSAMP subcommittee, and Paul Bodetta, former council member that was on the BeachSAMP subcommittee, are here tonight to be part of this. But the Coastal Council is a science-based organization. We try to use the best available science in all our decision-making and try to understand what the realities of our situation are. The BeachSAMP and the information that we're giving in this plan is trying to look at the realities of risk, particularly with our coastal environment and the storms that we're seeing, the potential for sea level rise and erosion as we go forward. What we've discovered in our studies that we've done and the tools that we've developed is that there are a series of government organizations that have seriously underestimated the risk of our shoreline, so we're trying to correct that through the tools that we're providing. But one thing, and this has been sort of a mantra of mine throughout this process, is virtually every regulation that's developed today is developed for today's conditions and do not anticipate future conditions. They don't give you the information that you need to build for that future condition. And again, that's where the BeachSAMP is trying to provide that information. One of the things we're developing, for instance, is a new suggested design elevation tool, which will not only give you the best and most current scientifically based flood risk in this state for the coastal region, but it will also do that for various sea level rise scenarios, so you can anticipate what that might look like in the future and build to that future condition so that you are more resilient than trying to build, for instance, taking a FEMA floodplain map and building to the base flood elevation on that. So this is one of the goals of ours, is to have this discussion of risk, because it's an environment that's changing very rapidly, and it has a lot of risk with it. That doesn't mean that we should necessarily stay away from it, but we should go in with eyes wide open as we start to go in these areas if we want to become more resilient. The other thing I just want to announce tonight is this will probably be our last stakeholder meeting before we actually adopt the document. As Teresa indicated, in April, we're looking at bringing chapters 3, 4, and 5 for adoption before the council. Teresa's got a schedule here that she'll show you here shortly of what the chapters are and their anticipated schedule, but we're looking at trying to get an adoption date of the entire plan by May 22nd of this year and have that in place. That document is a guidance document. It is intended to guide applicants and others in this assessment of risk and our conditions that we have, and then lay out a process for applicants to follow as they make it through our application process. In addition to that, we will be developing a component within our regulatory program that will follow up on the heels of this, that will require applicants to go through that. Now, the NOAA high curves are already adopted by the council. Storm tools has been adopted by the council, and in fact is already being used by our permitting staff in the process. Sure. Okay. Grab my notes. So the plan itself will be followed up with some regulation changes that would require this of applicants for new or substantially altered structures within our jurisdiction. As you'll see tonight too, we've also got a process that we're suggesting for municipalities, as well as some suggested changes in legislation and those types of things that would help municipalities better prepare for and become more resilient in the future. This is not the last that we're working on this, though. We are still in the tool development phase. We actually have ongoing projects with Barrington, Bristol, and Warren with our Coastal Environmental Risk Index. We also have a very similar project ongoing with Westerly, South Kingstown, and Narragansett, looking at this Coastal Environmental Risk Index. As I said, this May we're anticipating to have in place our suggested design elevation maps as part of our program. And we're going to continue on with the work that we're doing. We've in fact just received notification from NOAA that we're funded for a new tool development just recently, and that funding is expected to come into October. So this is not something, this plan is not something that we're just going to put out there and walk away from. This plan is intended to be a very adaptive mechanism, which is why it's a guidance document, so we can change and adapt readily without having to go through a formal regulatory process. So it's something that we are actively engaged in. This will not be necessarily the last time that you see us, but we are need to get the plan out in place so that we have this framework that we can start to work with to make Rhode Island more resilient. And with that, Teresa's gone. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Teresa and Tiffany. I think, oh, okay.
Thank you. We're still working out the sound issues. Great, thank you, Grover. So where are we with the development of the document? So as I mentioned earlier, we released 3 of the 7 chapters in the fall of 2017. And this kind of gives you an outline of where we are with the process. So the 3 chapters in blue are chapters 3, 4, and 5. Those have already been released for public comment, for public notice, and will be heard at the April 10th, 2018 council meeting up in Providence. The chapters that we're releasing tonight are chapters 6 and 7, state agency and municipal considerations, and then adaptation strategies and techniques. Tonight starts the 10-day public comment period for these 2 chapters. And because we wanted to try to get this adopted by May, we've decided to only do a 10-day public comment period because we still have to do the 30-day public notice period. I will also share with you all that during the public comment period for chapters 3, 4, and 5, we received 2 comments during the 30-day public comment period and 1 comment during the 30-day public notice period. So we didn't see that it was necessary or required to do a full 30 days before another 30 days. So we're giving you all 10 days to take a look at this as a preliminary review, and then you will have another opportunity during the full public notice period to give us additional comments if you didn't get them to us the first time on these 2 chapters. We have already released the introduction chapter a few years ago, so that will be updated. It's one of those chapters we did with the Ocean SAMP and past SAMPs, where we write the introduction to just let everybody know what we're intending to do with the SAMP projects. And at the end of the project, we want to take how the chapters shook out, because we didn't know exactly how each chapter was going to evolve. We want to review all of this and make sure the introduction reflects what the document, how the document crossed the finish line. So we will be updating the introduction, and we also have a chapter that summarizes the coastal hazards in Rhode Island. We've been talking about these coastal hazards throughout the entire SAMP process. So really this is just a way for us to capture all of the latest and greatest science, the best available science, as we like to say, into this chapter that just says what's available in terms of data for sea level rise, coastal erosion, and storm surge. We wanted to do this chapter last because as soon as we publish it, it's going to be out of date. There's going to be new data that come in. And we're trying to write it so that it can be easily updatable, whether it becomes updated every year or 2 years, but we're trying to keep that chapter a summary of the science available at the time of this being published. So what's going to happen with those chapters is on April 12th, you can see here April 12th, and then April 12th, we'll be releasing all 4 of those chapters for a 30-day CRMC public notice. And then on May 22nd, we will be hearing, the CRMC will be having a council meeting to review the summary of the public notice for all these chapters. So, just a review, with the adoption of the BeachSAMP, we have chapters 3, 4, and 5 being heard by the council on Tuesday, April 10th, 2018. Grover, what time do these meetings typically start? 6 o'clock up at the DOA, Department of Administration, one of the conference rooms in the Department of Administration. And then the council will hear chapters 1, 2, 6, and 7 again on Tuesday, May 22nd at 6 o'clock up in Providence. Okay, so as of tonight, we're starting the 10-day public comment period for chapters 6 and 7. Kathy has updated the BeachSAMP website, the management plan page, and that web link is on your agendas. So you can download the chapters from this site, and also we have comment forms. You can either write your comments right on the comment form button will take you to what's called a jot form, so you can submit your comments to us directly from that jot form online, or you can upload, if you write us a formal letter, you can upload a letter or other comments that you've written up on this jot form site. You can also, there's also a link on the site that will tell you how to mail us comments if that's your choice to get us comments. Now, we are doing a 10-day comment period, so our comment deadline is April 8th. On Monday, April 9th at 9 a.m., Grover and I are going to get together with Tiffany and review those comments. So we're going to jump right on it because we need to turn it around in 3 days and get the document back out for the CRMC public notice on that Thursday, the 12th. Okay. Are there any questions? All right, very good. So what we're going to do now is dive right into the 2 chapters that we're introducing tonight, chapters 6 and 7. And I will switch over. I'm going to present chapter 6, and Tiffany Smythe is going to present chapter 7. Okay. I have a laser pointer, I have a microphone, I have a remote control. We're going to see how this works. Oh, I think there's a laser pointer on the remote control. Yes, awesome. Okay, great. So as if everybody in here has, or most people have reviewed chapter 5, which was the CRMC permit application guidance process that the coastal agency is looking to implement for properties within the CRMC jurisdiction that are looking to secure a development permit from the CRMC. We wanted to take that chapter and consider how it applies to other state agencies and also to municipalities throughout Rhode Island. So the overview of the chapter, we summarize the purpose. We want to demonstrate how the guidance applies to other state agencies and municipal resiliency planning efforts. We want to highlight how the state agencies can better coordinate or consider coordination long-term with CRMC for state-funded projects. We wanted to look at the application of the CRMC permit guidance to municipal property outside of CRMC's jurisdiction, but still within the BeachSAMP planning area, and I'll review that with you in a minute. And then we also wanted to look at the state enabling legislation. We had some focus group meetings with municipal planners during this process of drafting this chapter, and we've learned a lot from them in terms of what can provide the municipalities with kind of protection and cover at the Rhode Island general laws level. So where can we start to think about where Rhode Island general laws can be revised to enable municipal governments to follow through with some of the recommendations that are coming out of the BeachSAMP with CRMC leading by example. So here's our BeachSAMP planning boundary. We've drawn this boundary representing a 100-year return period storm, which we've been saying throughout this process is similar to what we saw during Hurricane Carol in terms of water levels across the state. And then we've also projected on that, Malcolm Spalding and the ocean engineers, as well as our GIS gurus at the Environmental Data Center, the 100-year return period storm plus 7 feet of sea level rise. And you'll remember that when we started the BeachSAMP process, the 7-foot sea level rise scenario was projected for 2100. In 2017, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration came out with new numbers, and with CRMC adopting the NOAA high curve, we're now looking at 9 feet of sea level rise by 2100 based on NOAA's curve. The BeachSAMP is still communicating and illustrating 7 feet of sea level rise as that scenario because of the change in the data that I just mentioned of why we're writing Chapter 2 last. But we're staying with 7 feet of sea level rise as the maximum for our BeachSAMP planning area, even though the projection for that now is about 2085. Okay, so Chapter 6, what's included? So we wanted to take a look at, again, that land area outside of CRMC's jurisdiction, but within the shoreline change SAMP boundary. We want to emphasize pre-application meetings and overall coordination with CRMC for projects within the BeachSAMP planning boundary. We wanted to look at recommendations for both state agencies and municipalities to consider using the Storm Tools design elevation maps. And that those maps are highlighted as part of the process in Chapter 5, the permit guidance chapter. I think it's in Step 2 that we're requiring applicants to look at these maps and identify what the recommended design elevation will be for that property. There is information if you're interested in learning more about the Storm Tools design elevation maps. At our last stakeholder meeting, we do have the video online if you're interested in getting more information, or you can ask questions later. The summary of the availability of the Storm Tools design elevation maps, those maps will be available probably middle of 2018. So our engineer and GIS staffers are working on getting those done for the entire Rhode Island coastline. Some of our SERI communities, Charlestown, Warwick, Barrington, Warren, Bristol, the rest of the South Coast have already been completed, and our team is finishing up those design elevation maps for the entire Rhode Island coastline. And then we also summarize the Rhode Island general laws to assist municipalities with implementation measures. So how it's organized, we start with looking at what the state can do, and then we get into the municipal, how the municipalities can use the CRMC, follow the CRMC's lead in making their own local decisions. What do we need to consider for addressing risk at the local level, and then also state law. And as we're ending most of these BeachSAMP chapters with future research needs, we were able to get to a certain point through this BeachSAMP process, but there are certainly, in some cases, more questions than answers, and we definitely need to consider ways to secure additional funding to provide more resources and tools to our cities and towns and state agencies. So the overview is we wanted to emphasize that, as you guys know, CRMC has been working on this for the last 5+ years and has been really leading Rhode Island, not only the state agencies, but also Rhode Island has been is known to be leading the country in putting forward this process to require property owners to document their risk profile in a permit, on a coastal permit. California has been one state that we've been following very closely, as is New Hampshire. There are other states that are really looking at this, but CRMC, with the adoption of the BeachSAMP, will be one of the first states in the country to follow through on this. We want to make sure that that forward-thinking attitude about coastal resilience is transferable to other places in the state, and both state agencies and municipalities. I've mentioned this, becoming a broken record a little bit, looking at the land area outside of CRMC's jurisdiction and also outside of the defined special flood hazard areas as defined by FEMA. And right now our building code requires that we, cities and towns, use that special flood hazard area as a defined planning boundary. And the BeachSAMP Storm Tools design elevation maps suggest another story of that, where the boundary of that special flood hazard area, if you want to call it that, can be in the future. So we want to really emphasize how, again, the towns can use these tools. And again, CRMC serving as a model, and Chapter 5, CRMC's process serving as a model for cities and towns. This is a month ago, less than a month ago actually, March 3rd, that was that nor'easter that brought a small surge event during a high tide. This was Saturday morning, March 3rd at about 8:30. This is on My Coast, if anyone's been uploading photographs to My Coast. This is in Bristol along the East Bay Bike Path. There's a seagull floating right next to the East Bay Bike Path. There are a bunch of other photos I took too of bridges and roads. That at Papasquash Point is right over here in Bristol, and that roadway was covered in seawater. But we want to make sure that as projects in the future are pursued by our state agencies, that there is close coordination with CRMC and using the maps, the Storm Tools maps, and also the Storm Tools design elevation maps to plan for the long-term resilience of these assets. One of the things we've mentioned at past stakeholder meetings is that the bridge, statewide planning did an assessment of all of the state roads and bridges in Rhode Island. And the bridge that was completed in 2009, the most recently constructed bridge, is the most exposed and vulnerable to sea level rise projections. And they only went to 5 feet of sea level rise. So the one that was most recently finished is the most vulnerable. We don't want to make that mistake again. Or making it a mistake is not, it wasn't necessarily a mistake. We want to be able to use the information we have to better plan for those assets moving forward. So I've been talking about coordination among state agencies and CRMC. We want to look at how other state agencies can use the tools that are being put forward in the BeachSAMP, long-term funding for the maintenance and management of storm tools, pre-application coordination, and then emergency ascents and post-storm permits from CRMC. At the municipal scale, again, municipalities following CRMC's lead, thinking about land outside of the special flood hazard area. One of the suggestions that the municipalities presented to us during our focus meeting with them was, well, can CRMC expand their jurisdiction so that CRMC is on the hook for any development applications with the entire BeachSAMP study area? And that would require CRMC to increase its staffing, both in permit staff and enforcement staff, and currently there are no funds to support CRMC expanding their jurisdiction to include all of the land area within that 100-year return period storm plus 7 feet of sea level rise. And then emphasizing municipalities requiring a submittal that summarizes that documents the risk assessment process that CRMC has provided to the cities and towns within their jurisdiction. So strategies that came out of those meetings: establishing thresholds, defining certain types of subdivisions or developments at the municipal scale. If the municipalities cannot staff up, and not all of them have, some of them don't even have planners at this point, some of them have a bigger planning staff than others, but where are the staff that can evaluate different development proposals? Those resources may not be available. So can we start with, as a first phase, identifying only certain types of projects that would trigger this process at the municipal scale? And holding pre-application site plan meetings that could also bring in resources from CRMC to consider the design life of the proposed development, identify a date that relates to future conditions that the applicant is planning for, looking at future flood and erosion scenarios, which we know that these FEMA maps currently do not project, and discussing uncertainty of the future conditions with the applicant. Those are all things that, again, municipal planners can choose to, there's no requirement now for them to do this at the local level. But with CRMC adopting this, is there an opportunity for the municipalities to do this on their own, following CRMC's example? And then what kinds of incentives might be available for applicants who voluntarily follow the CRMC guidance process outside of the CRMC jurisdiction? We also in the chapter cover 2 different types of local planning documents: comprehensive plans. And during a project a few years back, we developed, in partnership with statewide planning, a municipal model process for risk assessment. So that's another tool available for municipalities to consider the risk profile of coastal properties. And all of that information is compiled into a comprehensive plan guidebook. It's guidebook number 12 that addresses natural hazards. And natural hazards is a new requirement of comprehensive plans. It was passed in the 2012 Comprehensive Planning Act. And most municipalities have been working in the recent years to update their comprehensive plans with natural hazards, not just by reference to their hazard mitigation plan, but actually embedding that information in their comp plan with reference to changing future conditions. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. Also at the local level, we have hazard mitigation plans. The state, Rhode Island Emergency Management Agency provides guidance and a template for cities and towns to update their local hazmat plans. So considering how the state of Rhode Island is advancing coastal risk assessment and planning for future conditions where FEMA does not, we are in coordination with Rhode Island EMA to make sure that climate change impacts and related coastal hazards, erosion, storm surge, sea level rise are captured in their local hazard mitigation plans. We also have many communities that are part of this community rating system where they've undertaken some measures to provide savings on flood insurance premiums to those properties in the town that carry flood insurance. So there is potential for additional savings for CRS communities that can pass on to flood insurance policyholders. And then how we reference and use the storm tools and the storm tools design elevation maps in hazmat plans is another way that the municipalities can connect with what CRMC is doing. I pulled this in. This was provided by Jim Boyd at the CRMC. This is a map of Rhode Island that shows the communities that are in the CRS program and how that relates to our top 10 communities that have flood insurance policies in the state. So the municipalities in blue are participating cities and towns in the NFIP, and those ones with a green dot are currently CRS communities. So Westerly is a CRS 8, which means they provide 10% savings to their flood insurance policyholders. Charlestown is a CRS 7. They pass along a 15% savings to their policyholders. But there are some communities, South Kingstown, Providence, Barrington, and Portsmouth, that are currently not in the CRS program. So where are there opportunities for the BeachSAMP to encourage them and incentivize possibly those communities to get into the program? And where can we also provide points that they have to prove that there are certain measures that are being met in order to get a lower CRS score, but passing on a higher savings to their flood insurance policyholders. So this is, again, one of the ways that we're trying to figure out how the BeachSAMP can connect with our cities and towns along the coast. I could spend hours on this slide. I'm not going to, but I just want to call attention when you read the BeachSAMP, the Chapter 6 document, we did go into, in conversations with our municipalities, we did look into the different enabling legislation and where the opportunities are to revise the enabling legislation to position the municipalities to better implement the recommendations coming out of the BeachSAMP. So the State Building Code, Comprehensive Planning Act, the zoning law, subdivision and land development, and then highways and mapped streets. So I, again, could go on for a very long time about this. I'm not going to. I encourage you all to read that section. The summary takeaway from this is anywhere there's a reference to changing future conditions, we've tried to call out and summarize here because that we see as the opportunity for revisions to the general laws that can possibly require cities and towns to utilize the tools available for the state of Rhode Island and also the data that is sort of state-accepted data sources that CRMC and other agencies have been using in resiliency planning. And lastly, future research needs. So financial impacts, incentives, and cost-benefit analyses are questions that have come up throughout this process. What is the impact on municipal finance from changes in property taxes and the values of the properties at the coast and pre and post damage? Well, how does the second row in and the potential changes over time of the property value of the second and third row from the coast impact the tax rate or the municipal revenues from the property taxes? And are there incentives for property owners to invest in adaptation? If you voluntarily elevate your property, are you going to get hit with a higher property tax? Because you've made those improvements, your assessment may go up, and you also then may have to pay more tax. Are there ways to get around that so that we're not disincentivizing property owners from protecting their asset in the future? We don't have answers to these questions, but these are opportunities for future projects to bring those tools, those resources to our cities and towns. We've also been looking a lot at municipal liability. We had a meeting of the city and town solicitors in December of 2015 over at Roger Williams University. And we also have, Grover's been in touch with the Conservation Law Foundation, who have done they've pulled together a 2018 booklet on municipal liability and sort of positioned some of the concerns and issues related to municipal liability. And I think we saw that exemplified in the video tonight and some of the remarks that Grover made about disclosure of risk and who is ultimately liable if you approve a certain development and a storm comes in and results in damage. There are a lot of questions related to this that we just don't have answers to at this time. And then, as mentioned in other chapters, site systems and groundwater dynamics. This actually shows up throughout the BeachSAMP document. There are changes to the groundwater that could affect wastewater treatment systems on site, private wells with saltwater intrusion. A lot more data and information is needed on that topic. So that gives you a quick summary of Chapter 6. Again, I'll reiterate that we have a 10-day public comment starting tonight. When you leave this meeting tonight, you can go home and download these chapters from the BeachSAMP website. Comments are due by Sunday, April 8th, and then the 30-day CRMC public notice begins 4 days after that on April 12th, 2018. Are there any questions on Chapter 6? Don?
And that's a necessary thing, and as I think about it, it's quite likely different from town to town, depending on their conditions. You see the town plan and the hazard mitigation documents that you talk about, do you see those as risk management, or should something else be thought about?
That's a very good question. For you at home on the webcast, the question is, can the risk assessment tools and process that we've laid out in the BeachSAMP be information to inform a risk management plan? And do the 20-year comprehensive plan and 5-year hazard mitigation plan at the local level serve as that resource? I think there's a lot of potential for that. Every town is in charge of, they make decisions on how they want to present this information in their comprehensive plan, which is the 20-year blueprint for the town in the future. And coupled with the 5-year hazard mitigation plan, which is really focused on emergency response. Between those two documents, there's a lot of potential for a management plan to look long-term. For example, if you think about the state TIP, the Transportation Improvement Program, where are those roadways that can be eligible for inclusion on the state TIP for federal funding and have the climate change lens or the coastal hazard lens be put on those projects. If those are articulated, which they usually are in comprehensive plans and maybe in the hazmat plan, that can definitely, so you don't have to create a new plan called the risk management plan to embed those kinds of recommendations, I think is supported by not only the 2012 Comp Plan Act that required natural hazards be included in the comp plan, but also through the 5-year hazmat plan.
I think a section in the local plans
is the hazards. Yeah. Yep. Every town is different. Some towns are referring to natural hazards in every single chapter and not doing a separate chapter. Most towns that I've talked to are doing a separate, an individual, a focused chapter on natural hazards. And then in a couple of towns, they're trying to flag policies, goals, and actions in other comp plan elements that relate to the new kid on the block, the natural hazards information. So every town can make a decision how they want to present it, so it kind of varies.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Yes?
This is all voluntary, but this is all guidance.
Yes.
And you mentioned one point
That's an area of future research. Grover.
Currently, for example, we encourage people to go through the fortified process. So that's either for rehabs or for new structures that are being built. The fortified program is by the International Business and Home Safety Institute. It's a Code Plus program. It gives the structures more oomph in terms of trying to deal with these storms. And they certify various products to go into those. So it's sort of like your underwriter's laboratory for building products for these storm materials. If they go through that process, the CRMC, for example, offers an expedited process for those homes, provided they're not seeking a variance to any of the other standards. We will guarantee a time in and out the door. That was working with the Rhode Island Builders Association. That's what they wanted the most, was guaranteed times. So that's what we offer as an incentive. There may be other incentives that are possible. One of the things that, for instance, that's done sometimes with renewable energy projects is to provide a tie-in to the property and a longer amortization schedule for some of these. So if you're putting a new foundation in, that's a significant investment in that home. If you can amortize that over a 20 or 30-year period and tie it into the property like your sewer lines are, then it becomes a much more affordable action for people to undertake. As Teresa indicated too, also municipalities could offer not taxing people on the improvements that are made for resilience actions. So if you put that new foundation in and you elevate your home out of the floodplain, you shouldn't get taxed for that on that additional improvement. So these are things that I think are out there that we can offer as incentives to get people to start to undertake these actions and make it
monetary in some cases.
Yes.
Could be significant.
Yes.
In some cases.
And as you elevate, the other incentives that you get, for instance, is you're getting more improved flood insurance rates and those types of things. So yes, there's definitely a monetary component to it.
Great. Other questions? We'll do one more and then we'll move on to Tiffany.
Yeah, Randy Weaver, North Kingstown. Shortly after Hurricane Katrina down in New Orleans, I went down there and did some research on it. Had the opportunity to meet with the mayor and Army Corps of Engineers and the emergency management folks down there. And what I had found is that there were a lot of plans on the local, the state, and the federal level. Everybody had a plan, but it didn't do any planning. They didn't get together as a group.
Yeah.
Sort of war game this.
Yeah.
You have what appears to be a very proactive approach. You have a lot of data. Do you do anything of war? I'm not trying to put you in a spot, but do you do anything of war gaming with Rhinelup and in Providence, local, state, and perhaps even federal level?
You just did this, right?
Yeah, there was an exercise just run by REMA, and it was more geared towards sort of post-recovery. So you're into the recovery mode. How do we go about coordinating so that we achieve this long-term resilience? It was a get-together. It was an initial foray into this area. What it revealed is that we still have a lot of work to do. There's a lot of further delving into particular topic areas that we need to do so that we understand what those issues are and the agencies are coordinating across the board. One of the things we did, for instance, after Hurricane Sandy, is what we do is we drop our people into the communities that are most damaged, and they go hand in hand with the local building official to make sure that the joint reviews are not going to be cross purposes with each other. And so we offer that to the applicants going into this as well as the emergency permits. Some of the things that Teresa's talking about that we became concerned about after Hurricane Sandy, for instance, and I'm sure you saw it on a larger scale in Katrina if you were down there, is that municipal governments typically aren't geared towards thinking towards that most catastrophic event. And you get into a situation where you're suddenly flooded with a series of permit requests, but you have no way of responding to that because you're still stuck in the old mode of issuing permits. And that's a concern of ours because we saw that in Sandy. We were suggesting people, for instance, that if they wanted to get our permit, they were going to have to relocate the structure further back in the areas to get them back. The communities were concerned because I was going to put them to the zoning board and they wouldn't get before the zoning board for 6 months. You can't do that in a post-storm situation of any significance because the system will just implode at that point. These are things that we're well aware of and that we're trying to make others aware of so that there are post-storm permitting processes put in place that anticipate those conditions and start to deal with it. And that's also brought out in the BeachSAMP.
I have one addition to that, actually. Through some funding that Rhode Island Sea Grant and Coastal Resources Center has secured from a combination of several different funding sources. We've been, as you guys may remember, we've been mosaicing lots of different funding sources to support the shoreline change SAMP for the last 5 or 6 years. We're going to continue, CRC in particular, our staff here at the Coastal Resources Center are continuing to provide outreach and education and resources for the cities and towns after the BeachSAMP wraps. And we launched the Providing Resilience Education Planning in Rhode Island online training modules for planning boards and commission members at the local level. And our next round of funding, or the funding we have available for the next year and a half, is focused on pilot projects in the communities. So where can we go out to the cities and towns? We have relationships with all the municipal governments along the coastline and help work with them to identify actual implementation projects so that we can work through this process, tee them up for writing a grant application or putting in for funding that actually can result in a ribbon cutting and result in some sort of tangible implementation that illustrates how important this is at the municipal level. Grover's already worked with the 195 Commission on the pedestrian bridge that's currently being constructed in Providence along the across the Woonasquatucket River. You've also informed the Narragansett Public Works Department on the design of the wastewater treatment facility there. So there's been coordination already, but I think carrying this through and illustrating potential for actual project level planning and implementation is what's really going to drive this home and show that these adaptation measures are realistic and result in a no regrets end product.
I think one other addition to that I think sort of is, in my opinion, very forward-thinking and took a lot of guts was the city of Warren has come to the conclusion that their sewage treatment plant only probably has about 40 years of life left in it. Then they're going to have to seek another location because that location, that location just isn't viable into the future. So they are already looking at and potentially considering other sites that they can relocate that plant to. So those are the types of actions. But to get to your point, I get worried because we have not experienced an event of any magnitude since 1954, and I don't think people understand how potentially catastrophic those events can be. And that's my fear, is that it's going to paralyze us. But
great, thanks. Kathy, can we hold your question until the last half hour? Do you mind? I want to get Tiffany's presentation up here, and she's going to talk about adaptation techniques and strategies. So I think it's a good segue into that, and we'll have a half an hour at the end to have other questions. I'll do that, Tiffany, if you want. And Dr. Tiffany Smythe from the Coastal Resources Center.
Hi, folks. I don't know about you, but I'm really happy that the sound is better, right? I was sort of dreading coming up here and speaking with that problem. Thank you for your patience with that, all kidding aside. Tonight I'm going to be sharing with you a quick overview of Chapter 7, which is Adaptation Strategies and Techniques for Coastal Properties. Before I get into this, I just want to give a shout out to James Yeager, who's sitting right here. He's an undergraduate student in Marine Affairs here at URI, and he worked with me doing a lot of the initial research and thinking on this chapter, so thank you, James. All right, so the purpose of Chapter 7 is to provide an overview of adaptation strategies and tools for property owners and decision makers to use in preparing for and adapting to changing coastal conditions. And I just want to remind folks, I'm sure many of you are familiar, but the term adaptation refers to the process of adjusting to actual or expected climate and its effects. And so we're talking about making adjustments to existing and future coastal development at the structural, site, or community level scale. And as you know, as you saw in Teresa's presentation, a reminder that the Shoreline Change SAMP is focused on 3 coastal hazards in particular: storm surge, coastal erosion, and sea level rise. So we're talking about adaptation measures that are appropriate for those hazards. Just to give you a feel for what kind of information is included in this chapter, first, we did not limit ourselves to those strategies and tools which are currently eligible for permitting by all relevant state and federal and local entities, including CRMC. And this is deliberate. The goal instead was to include a broad suite of strategies and tools in order to get folks thinking, to encourage consideration of the full range of adaptation measures that may be necessary to adapt Rhode Island's coastal communities to change. Okay. This chapter is made up of 3 parts, pretty straightforward. We do an introduction, and then we dive right into adaptation tools, strategies for coastal properties, close out with a lot of resources. That overview section really provides our objectives. It defines a lot of the relevant terms, and includes some discussion about adaptation, some of the key challenges that we have in choosing adaptation measures and sort of keeping up with the field. And some of those key messages to share with you here. Many of you may be familiar, adaptation tools and techniques are typically categorized as forms of protection or accommodation or retreat. We'll be getting into those as we talk here. Adaptation strategies can be applied at the scale of an individual structure or a site or an entire community. And adaptation strategies can also include technical things that one can do or policy and planning strategies. This chapter focuses on that full range of tools and techniques, protection, accommodation, and retreat. We are focused at the site and structural scale primarily, not at the community scale, and we're focused on technical strategies. So some other key things to think about as we dive into the subject of adaptation. We write in the chapter, the choice is not whether or not to adapt, but it's what measure are you going to choose, because we're going to have no choice but to adapt. Choice of adaptation measures is site and context specific. There is no one measure that's perfect. There's no one size fits all. And importantly, there are issues with all of these adaptation measures. None of them are a silver bullet solution for things. Choice of adaptation measures requires looking to the future beyond what's required in existing regulations. And then this field is rapidly changing. And because it's rapidly changing, this is a lean chapter. We could have written a 10-volume, we could have had a 6-year process just about documenting adaptation measures. But we chose to be lean here to give you a quick overview to what's known in the field right now, and then encourage folks to look elsewhere where there's rapidly evolving and very detailed information about some of these techniques. So this is a list of the types of adaptation tools and strategies that we explore in the chapter, and I'm going to take you through these one at a time. We begin this section going through these tools and strategies with a summary table that is a useful reference for you. It lists the strategies, and it indicates whether they can be applied to existing or new construction, whether they are a form of protection or accommodation or retreat, and whether they are site or structural. This is not the entire table here. This is just a screenshot of part of it to give you a feel for it. And so to begin now with adaptation tools and techniques, the first one that we talk about here is a form of, is really emphasizing site selection. And this is the place to start from Grover Fugate's perspective, and I think our entire team's perspective when we're thinking about adaptation. The way to protect yourself is to choose a site that is inland and elevated and not exposed to these coastal hazards. And now this can be applied to either existing construction or new construction. If you're new construction, you're choosing the property that you wish to buy, you can make these choices. But if you already have a coastal parcel, you can choose the spot, hopefully, you can choose the spot on your parcel where you build so that it is as far inland and as far elevated as is possible. Okay. Now, next comes terrain management. So once you start building, and this really applies to new construction, a way to accommodate potential flood risk is to design your site so that it is graded and laid out in such a way that floodwaters are not exacerbated, so that they're not pooling around the building like you see in this picture. Now, this is an urban setting, so it's not quite the perfect fix, but the idea here is very fundamentally we can grade sites, lay them out, and build in drainage so that flooding is not exacerbated on that site. Next, we have a good deal of discussion about natural or nature-based adaptation measures. And these are generally a suite of measures that involve using natural features and ecosystem services to protect or accommodate from coastal hazards while having that habitat and that ecosystem service. So these include coastal bank protection, natural and engineered ways of reinforcing banks using natural materials, reinforcing sediment. Living breakwaters, which can include oyster and mussel reefs, which can in some cases serve as wave attenuation mechanisms. Dune restoration or beach nourishment, both of which I'll bet you're familiar with, but which in addition to being means of managing recreational assets, especially in the case of beach nourishment, are ways to protect upland development from coastal hazards. And then coastal wetland creation or enhancement. So again, ways to enhance those natural features so that they absorb stormwaters and so on, protecting upland development. And to emphasize here, natural and nature-based measures are CRMC's preferred options. So we do have a good deal of discussion in the chapter about that. Just one example, I mentioned coastal bank enhancement, and so this picture is from King Park in Newport here, and that figure on the left shows that there is a quar, they call it a burrito. It's like a quar log or a tube that's right in that bank, and it helps stabilize that sediment. And we rely heavily on a recent project that took place. It was led by the Northeast Regional Ocean Council, of which CRMC is a part, working with the Nature Conservancy, and then Woods Hole Group up in Massachusetts. That team developed a state of the practice for what they call living shorelines in New England. It's the same topic. There are it's a nice overview of these kinds of techniques and how they are applicable in this part of the country. And this includes a series of profiles like the screenshot here that provide nice detail and graphics associated with those different measures. Next we come to flood barriers, which are really a vertical structure that is a way of protecting an upland, protecting a development from floodwaters. A levee, like was referenced in that earlier video, is an extreme example. We don't write about levees in the chapter because we're not talking about levees here in Rhode Island. But we do talk about there being flood walls on a smaller scale, or even temporary flood barriers like what you see pictured here. Those are panels, vertical panels that can be moved in front of a building in preparation for a storm. We also talk about floodgates and tide gates, which are designed to close in anticipation of a storm or a high tide. And then berms, which are really embankments that can protect the development. And a couple of other pictures here of temporary flood barriers. These are at FM Global's facility up in Johnston. And again, the idea here is to have a vertical structure that can be moved in front of a building, or the orange is an inflatable structure. Next, I'm sure many folks here are familiar with structural shoreline protection measures. In other words, seawalls, revetments, and bulkheads. We acknowledge these in the chapter, though we clearly state that CRMC prohibits new structures on barriers and shorelines adjacent to Type 1 waters. CRMC staff have found that this kind of adaptation measure is often the costliest and the least adaptable of adaptation measures. And to emphasize the range of area where such barriers, such new structures are prohibited, this is, you all know, a screenshot of our entire south coast from Point Judith to Watch Hill. This entire area is Type 1 water, so that means new structural shoreline protection measures are prohibited along that entire area, as is shown in this map right here. Next we come to structural modifications. A lot of what we've been talking about are site modifications, ways that you can either protect or accommodate coastal hazards. Here we're talking about ways that you can modify a structure. And this first category is wet flood proofing, which sounds counterintuitive, but that's, in other words, prepare a building to get wet, but to be able to recover easily after that, to not be permanently damaged. So a good example you actually saw in that video earlier, it's choice of building materials, for example, choosing concrete rather than drywall, or tile rather than wood for floor. We also look at other things like installing wall openings and vents so that if waters do come in, they can pass right back out. And then the next category of structural modifications is dry floodproofing. So this category is keeping the water out. And so this involves installing things like impermeable building materials or sealants, watertight doors or windows, and so on. And these are presented here as retrofit measures, but a new construction could theoretically have these as well. And next, talking about retrofit measures, Grover earlier mentioned the Fortified program, which addresses a different set of coastal hazards than what we've been talking here. They address wind, hail, and hurricanes. But what this program does is it provides an incentive for residences to begin to make their home more resilient, at least to those hazards. And so, for example, if you chose the bronze level of adaptation here, you would be reinforcing your roof system against wind. And I should mention here, and I actually think Grover said it before, CRMC offers an incentive for participation in this program in the form of expedited permitting. So everything we've been talking about up until now has been protection or accommodation. How can we protect development from these hazards or accommodate a site, or water and so on, into a site? Here now we're talking about relocation or managed retreat. And so this means, in other words, removing oneself or that structure from harm. And this can sound to some folks as pretty dramatic, but in fact there are incremental, straightforward ways that one can move in this direction toward this kind of an adaptation measure. For example, we kind of began with it when we were talking about site selection. Choosing a site that is inland, elevated, is effectively a form of relocation or managed retreat. Beyond choosing a site, one can also, if you're building in an area that you know is exposed to sources of coastal hazard risk, you can build your building in such a way that it can easily be moved when the time does come to move back. And so examples include, things like basements and caissons are not as easily movable as other parts of a building, right? And finally, the next step really when we're talking about relocation or managed retreat may be actually choosing to move a structure further inland or choosing not to rebuild in a more exposed area following an extreme storm event. And it's a great picture of that. And here we can see the building movers company moving a building back. And I think Teresa knows the details of this picture, which I do not. All right. So we close out the chapter with a lot of resources for folks, a lot of places to go for further information. Some of those include the Living Shorelines report that I mentioned earlier. We direct folks to FM Global, which has a great deal of very detailed data sheets with some of these strategies. We direct folks to the Fortified program, and then we also have a variety of publications and tools that URI has developed as part of the BeachSAMP and beyond that we direct folks to as well for more information. And so with that, I'll close out. This is the exact same story as with Chapter 6. We're starting that 10-day public comment period tonight, so please offer us your thoughts by April 8th at midnight. And then just like Chapter 7, this doesn't say it here, but this then will go up for that 30-day public notice period beginning on April 12th. And with that, thank you, and I'll take your questions.
Choose them. They're developed communities. People don't have these options. You can't take a house that's on a 100 by 100 lot with another house behind you at a 100 lot and one on your right at a 100 lot and move it to a preferred site. You can't take that house and then adapt it by putting in berms. So 90% of the people that are going to have the impacts, as was mentioned in Katrina and in Sandy, and that we've seen many times before, I'm not going to hear anything from this adaptation process.
Grover, sounds like you want to respond to that?
Where do we go with that?
The microphone. And Grover, could you repeat the questions? I'm getting text messages from everybody at home saying they would like to hear the question.
Okay. The question is, and I think it's sort of more of a statement in one regard, and if you don't mind, I'll paraphrase it. A lot of our development is existing and predated a lot of the building codes that would help deal with some of these events. And because of their site constraints, the fact that they're existing developments, it limits the options that they have available to them. And what you're seeing here, you didn't believe, addresses those existing conditions. It's one of the reasons, actually, that we went with the Fortified program. The Fortified program was designed as a retrofit program. It was designed to go in and look at a structure and pick it apart and enhance how it could be retrofitted to deal with those threats. For instance, the roof system that you saw there, when people go to replace their roofs, they can go to the bronze level roof at that stage and enhance its resiliency, particularly for wind and storms. So we were very cognizant of that going forward into this, that there aren't a lot of options for those, but the Fortified program is one. It was specifically designed as a retrofit. It works much better for new homes, but you can go in and retrofit these structures. I think our difficulty here in Rhode Island is going to be is that for a lot of these structures, particularly for the middle class individuals, to deal with what they need to do, they're going to need some sort of financial incentives to get there. If you're talking about a structure that's below base flood elevation, and the only way they can start to deal with that is to elevate that home, that gets very expensive. And to make that move, they're going to need incentives to get there. We are still working with the Army Corps, for example, on a project on the South Shore. They've identified over 340 structures in the South Shore that they believe would benefit from elevation and getting them up. And the Army Corps just sent that on to headquarters for a funding mechanism. But that's a $70 million program that would be aimed at those homes, which the Corps would pick up 65% of the cost to elevate those structures. So we are trying to find those things to help get us there, but it's a very valid point. It's much more difficult in these established areas, and unfortunately, that's the vast majority of our development. Something we've got, and we're going to have to figure out how to deal with. It's not an easy situation.
Actually, if you go to Roy Carpenter's Beach, there has been redevelopment and moving. What I'm curious about from being abroad is, has anybody done any research about how it's affected their insurance? I know when you look, just as an example, I photograph there pretty regularly, so I asked one of the people who live there, well, how come all of the elevations are different? And he said, oh, they're all in different flood zones. Like, oh, really? So they don't have any idea. Some of the houses are 5 feet elevated, some are 1 foot above base flood elevation.
Yeah. The front row in most of those is not developed to any flood standard. A lot of them, for instance, are on cinder block foundations.
Can you just repeat that it's Roy Carpenter's Beach?
Oh, it's Roy Carpenter's Beach. You've indicated, and yes, part of that is because they don't actually own the property. And what happens is, as the first row goes or it gets damaged, they leapfrog in behind the next row.
Now, that's not actually, they were all told to move, and they didn't do it. And when Sandy came along, the owner said, if you don't move, we will no longer rent the land to you.
Yeah.
So, and supposedly the opposite, that was the east side. The west side, I think, is supposed to be moving, but nothing seems to be going anywhere.
Yeah. So the different elevations have to deal with the fact that the ones that are leapfrogging back, the building officials holding them to the new floodplain standards. So if you see those are actually elevated on pile-supported structures to deal with the floodplains. So what they're doing is the new ones that are being built are adhering to the new flood codes. But you're right, it's not that vastly different. There is a dissipation of the surge and waves as it goes across the landscape that naturally dissipates, but it's still a flood zone.
Yeah, but some of the houses in there have been elevated to 5 feet next to a house that's been elevated to 1 foot.
Yeah.
There's no standard.
No. It's personal choice in that case many times.
That's right. As a zoning board member, we came up with a lot of rules and regulations there, South Kingstown, and they're doing the best they can. And it's unfortunate, but it's a community, and the land is not owned by individuals, it's owned by everybody in the this has been going on for 5 years, and now the state of Rhode Island has a new resiliency officer.
He's sitting in back of you, in fact.
How does your work relate to everything that Sean is doing?
Well, why don't we let...
And there's got to be some interaction.
I was going to actually introduce Sean here as we went along. Sean O'Rourke is the new resiliency officer. He's with the Infrastructure Bank. I don't know if you want to answer that one, Sean.
I thought I was going to be able to sit in the back.
Will you mind coming down? Since we only have one mic tonight. Normally I would, and just repeat the question if you don't mind, and here are your cameras.
Sure. The question was, how does all of this work that CRMC is doing on the BeachSAMP relate to a existing effort that we have going on at the state level called the Statewide Climate Resilience Action Strategy, which is to be delivered to the governor by July 1st. The focus of our work at this statewide level is identifying what specific actions and investment the state can take under our ownership of assets and areas around the state that we can really drive those critical projects, policies and actions, and then funding and financing mechanisms. There's a lot of work that's inside of this BeachSAMP that we want to make sure that we're linking to, and we want to make sure that the guidance inside of the BeachSAMP directly is mirrored inside of the best practices that we're going to be put forward inside of the action strategy. There's going to be two pieces to this action strategy, kind of about a 50 to 60 page narrative, looking at everything from critical infrastructure, and we're breaking that up into water, power, transportation, and food sectors. We're looking at natural systems, coastal and upland, emergency preparedness, community resilience, and then a funding and financing chapter as well. And all of the work that's been presented tonight and throughout the SAMP kind of weaves its way throughout, working directly with CRMC and some of their staff on the natural system side, on the coastal aspect, but much of what's talked about tonight in the adaptation strategy are going to be put up right up front, as well as part of the second part of the strategy, which is going to be tied to basically a prioritized to-do list around those three buckets or areas of activity. And we're going to be identifying things that we can actually get shovels in the ground, capital projects done, to actually, to Teresa's point, really start to show tangible progress. And we're going to be identifying work that's tied to existing vulnerability studies and reports that have been done. And to your great point earlier, I've been doing a list of all of the vulnerability studies and reports that have been going on around Rhode Island just since 2014, since the governor took office. There's 54 planning and vulnerability studies across all state agencies. And so there's a lot of work to be done to move from planning to implementation. It oftentimes to hit that wall. So we're leveraging all the work that's been done before to move these projects forward. And so that's the big filter in terms of prioritization, is looking at what's already been done. And much of the work that Grover and CRMC and CRC has done is leveraging that effort.
And it may actually be then work, probably something may happen. It's not just planning. There may be, like you say, shoveling the ground.
It has to happen. That's what we're doing. It has to happen. And so we're prioritizing work that we can control at the state level first, but also recognizing that a lot of what's been discussed tonight is that municipalities are on the front lines, right? Strapped for resources, strapped for cash, strapped for expertise. How can this guidance help drive those municipalities forward in terms of increased resilience? But we're starting at the statewide level within the EC4, which is the Executive Climate Change Coordinating Council, level 11 director agency, really assists the governor in climate change preparedness. So we're staying within that sort of statewide level now, but then using this guidance to drive municipal action.
Thank you, Sean. Yes.
Playing a little bit on that and Paul's comment relative to existing structures. We noted that there's 400 plus. There's 400 plus housing units, if you will, that have been identified that are in the floodplain and were eligible for some assistance to become more resilient. And $70 million earmarked for that work on those structures. And yet the briefings that I've been to, I think it was Army Corps, they started giving percentages of those homeowners that would avail themselves of that money and the changes. And the percentages are extremely low. I think they were down 20-30%, something like that. People don't want to move back. They don't want to elevate. They don't want to get out of their house. So it's a little bit more complicated, I think, than, and it's good. We leverage. We've got people really focused. I like that. But it truly is a pretty complex problem. And when you're actually giving money, people don't want to take it. They're just afraid of it, or they think that doomsday will not show up.
Hold on. We got this, Grover.
No, it's an excellent point. The Army Corps, in their previous project that they did in Connecticut, had about a 40% participation rate. The problem is particularly a lot of these are primary residents. So what the Corps needs to do is they need to essentially elevate that structure somewhere else, put a new foundation in, go back and then put that house on. So a homeowner potentially could be out of their structure for 3 to 4 months at least while that's going on. There aren't many homeowners that are willing to make that change in order to avail of this stuff. Plus then the cost of the foundation itself, because while the Corps picks up 65%, they still have to pick up the other 35%. And if there isn't a loan program that allows them to amortize that cost, it's going to be very, very difficult for many homeowners to deal with that. And yes, these are all realities that I think are out there that we're going to have to deal with. We're trying to encourage and find ways to do that before the storms, before the sea level rise hits us, because it becomes much more problematic on the other side once we get there with a storm, and we've got a lot of devastation that's around us. So to the extent that we can try to figure this out and move it there, that's what we're about. That's why we're opening up the door for all these adaptation measures to try to look at these issues and try to move us along. It took us, 150 years to get here. We're not going to get away from it overnight.
I think that the biggest hammer you have is probably the insurance rates that will force people to adapt, become more resilient. So I don't know what other hammers exist, but that would be one mechanism.
Yeah.
Just repeat, if you don't mind.
Yeah, what Don just indicated, that he thought that probably the biggest incentive people would have would be insurance rates, either through their homeowners program or through the flood insurance program. For those of you who are unfamiliar, prior to last year, FEMA is about $25 billion in debt. They're now about $46 billion in debt after the storms last year, and that debt level keeps on increasing. Ultimately, it's likely that Congress is either going to have to make that program more actuarial based, which means jacking people's flood insurance rates, or spinning it off to the private market, which would have the same effect. So that's why we need to start looking at this and dealing with it, because those future conditions, if you built to today's conditions, for instance, and you took the FEMA floodplain map and you went with that and you provided the extra foot of freeboard, which you're required to in the building code, if NOAA's projections come true, that foot of freeboard will disappear within the first 20 years of your home life. After that, you're now below base flood elevation and subject to the higher rates that FEMA is going to charge in the future. So within your mortgage period, you could find yourself below BFE and starting to have to pay those very hefty rates. That's why we're trying to give information to people to build to and anticipate that, so you can provide for that extra freeboard and build that in. Because even the president of the Rhode Island Builders Association, Dave Caldwell, will tell you the cost at the point of construction is negligible in providing that extra freeboard. It's nothing compared to the cost of the house. So why not? Why not build that extra? Because all you're going to do is get a reduction on your flood insurance program now and into the future.
Get my exercise.
Thank you. You mentioned the big hammer being insurance rates, or that was thrown out there. I mean, another big hammer will be the storms and when they come. And I think your point earlier about having a plan in place for post-storm response is so important, because they're inevitable. And at that time, you mentioned the idea of expediting the process of rebuilding, which is usually when we end up back in this process again. So I was just wondering if there's thoughts that maybe you could comment on how the state's looking at addressing that.
one of the points we made when we were there at the rebuilding forum that was held by REMA is, again, these tools that we're providing allow you to look into the future and not make those same mistakes again. So what they provide is an anticipation of sea level rise or storm surge and how that might increase into the future. So when you rebuild to those future conditions, not going back necessarily right back to where you were. There are other things that we're looking at. As I said, this is why this plan was adopted as a guidance document, to be adaptable, because this is going to be, for the next 30, 40 years at least, a very rapidly changing field. We already have Moody's warning municipalities that if they don't take climate change into account and they don't start to deal with it from both the planning and infrastructure level, they will downgrade their bond ratings. That's another mechanism for this to start to occur. So there are things that are out there, and this is a moving target right now for us, and we're going to have to remain very flexible and adjust as we go on. But we have the best tools available in the state of Rhode Island. No other state has attempted to do this at a statewide level, down to the property level. In fact, we are, as Teresa indicated, we put forward a project with the National Science Foundation, when Malcolm led some of the Rhode Island efforts here to do that. But New Hampshire wants to take essentially the same process that we're just in the place of adopting and export that to New Hampshire and use that in New Hampshire now. So people are starting to see Rhode Island as an example. We've already given 3 presentations at national forums. I just gave one last week to the coastal program managers across the nation. We were asked to present because we're leading the nation in this effort. I've been asked to also make a presentation at a number of other forums. We have one for the Storm Preparedness Conference that's being held in Florida. We've been asked to make a presentation on this because people are really interested in the stuff we're doing. It is cutting edge. It is way ahead of everybody else. Particularly as we are using storm tools, we can get down to that individual structural level and look at this. So as bad as it may seem, Rhode Island is way ahead of everybody else. And if we can continue to capitalize on that, we can also then use this as sort of a business platform for other industries to sort of spin off and show what Rhode Island's doing and try to apply it to other areas.
Another question from Sean.
Got me going, now I can't stop.
To the adaptation measures, one of the things I didn't see, unless I missed it, was there was kind of retreat, accommodation, but there wasn't kind of talk about the buyout opportunities post-storm for repetitive lost properties. And we have a few precedents here in Rhode Island of some municipalities, and it's, I think, an interesting tie-in to a formal program with a municipality. And it talks about the market rate changes pre and post-storm. Is that going to be included in the strategy or mentioned at all? I'm just curious because it's something that I hear a lot in bit of my outreach around the state as a potential strategy to move structures out of harm's way, which we know that's probably the most productive adaptation solution.
Thank you.
Yes, the short answer is we've looked at that. The unfortunate situation is most of the buyout program you see are post-storm. So until the storm actually arrives and destroys everything, the money's not available. To do it pre-storm, I don't know many people in this room that would sell at a reduced market value of their home, and our coastal properties are typically at 7 figures or greater. The situation that we have is, even if we had a $30 million buyout program here in Rhode Island every year, that's 10 to 15 homes a year. It doesn't do a lot. The other thing is, for sea level rise, I get concerned on an equity issue because there's not enough money in the Treasury with the anticipated sea level rise rates to do buyouts for those. So when do you stop? You buy the first row out, second row's there. It's like I used to say to Steve Alford, the town manager of South Kingstown. He said, that first row of houses is 20% of my tax base. Right. And I've always said to them, don't worry, Steve, there will always be a first row. But it's a problem with the buyout programs because, as I said, most of the opportunities we've seen is post-storm. It was fairly successful in New York, but not so successful in New Jersey. They had a very, very limited participation rate in New Jersey, and it's created problems for some of their communities down there. The other thing is, if it's done through FEMA, I think if you were to ask the municipalities that engaged in the FEMA process, it's torturous at best for them, so.
Okay, I just want to go back. Oh, is there a question over here? No? Paul?
I don't know if this goes to Sean or to you, Grover, but and I know we can't be a political entity. I understand the dynamics of that. But how do we get the governor and the legislature to understand that unless we put money into those loan programs, whether through the housing association or however they want to structure it, every municipality is going to lose millions and millions of dollars. The state will lose tens of millions in its own infrastructure. And I understand that, you know, the federal government is now denying everything that we're talking about here tonight, and it's wiped it off all their websites so it doesn't exist. But we need to get the politicians in the state of Rhode Island to agree that this is a problem that we have to start addressing tonight. So how do we get that forum moving? Because until that forum moves, all this fantastic planning is left on the shoulders of the individual homeowner. And like you said, most of them can't afford it.
Thank you.
Well, that's an interesting one. I think, you know, the governor does recognize that resilience is a major issue, which is why she's hired Sean on to start to look at this issue and try to coordinate the efforts within the state. It's why we have the EC4. So we're starting, we're recognizing, but as I indicated, it's a very immense problem, it's very complicated, and it's going to take a while for us to get out of this. You're right, though, that we spend more on disaster recovery, and we're quite willing to go in after a storm and spend billions of dollars on disaster recovery, but very little on hazard mitigation. And we need to reverse that thinking, because if we can, it's much cheaper to do the mitigation than it is to do the recovery. Not to mention the emotional cost and all the rest of it for those individuals that are caught up in this, as you saw from this film. So it's something that's got to change. It's not going to happen overnight, again, Paul, but it's something that's very important. And I would suggest to you the numbers are not in the millions. They're in the billions. When we looked at, and we just did some property work in Charleston, for example, there was a recent article in the Providence Business News on it. That number for a 100-year event in Charleston is $1.1 billion of residential property at risk. So it's in the billions for our state, let alone other states. And it comprises, what is it, the percentage of the tax base for a 100-year storm in Charleston? 45, yeah.
Can I just follow up on that real quick? I don't have like the silver.
Come on down.
I don't have the silver bullet on this one. But a couple things I've learned in first couple days on the job, meaning like 9 months, but it feels like a few hours, is it being able to kind of meet our partners where they are, meaning the legislature and the governor, and a big focus of our work around the state is creating jobs and have an economically prosperous state. And the more resilient that we can become, the more economically prosperous we'll be. So if we can start framing these resilient adaptation messages and the work we need to do kind of through those terms, we might be able to move the ball. And so that's what we've been trying to do with our resilience strategy, is talking about this as jobs creation, talking about this as healthy, resilient communities, talking about this as driving new businesses to Rhode Island, because now we're going to be better prepared to deal with these issues using the tools that are projecting where should a new business relocate, right? Where should they be setting up shop? And so if we start to talk about it in those terms, I found that has been a productive conversation. And the other thing, to go back to what I said earlier, and we've talked about tonight, and Teresa mentioned it, is showing that we have tangible progress. Green bonds are not going to make our state resilient, but we've tied now for the first time in hopefully a new ballot measure for November, a clean water and green bond, which has a resilience component to it. So about $20 million are directly tied to the assets that we're looking at inside the resilience strategy. So there's a clear tie between funding, statewide funding, and resilient measures. On an order of magnitude, Governor Baker in Massachusetts just put forth a $1.4 billion green bond. Ours is $49.5 million. So, there's a scale issue here, but I think we're starting to now link where the money needs to go based on all of this great research and work and needs that we're seeing on the ground. So, a couple thoughts. Didn't necessarily answer your question, but that's some of the opportunities I've been seeing.
Well, you should also look at the green jobs that can be created today in all of that resilience work that brings on the advancement of the state. Landscapers, electricians, plumbers, all the trades union people. Those are green jobs that people aren't talking about.
Thank you. Thanks, Sean. I have a graphic. I want to go back to a slide in Tiffany's presentation. Since we are about 7 minutes before 8 o'clock, I'm going to get you out of here on time. Just an announcement. So as Tiffany mentioned, Chapter 7 is really heavily based on natural and nature-based solutions, and CRMC is encouraging those adaptation solutions. So on April 10th, the week of April 8th is busy. So we have the comment period ending on Sunday. We have Grover and I meeting and Tiffany to review the comments, and then Tuesday the 10th, we have a workshop called Engineering with Nature to Protect Rhode Island Shorelines. So this is happening right here at the Bay campus. I believe that the invitation went out on the BeachSAMP listserv. I'm getting head nods, good. So encourage you guys to register for this. It's $40 or $25 if you're with an NGO or government, all day. And this is part of the NROC initiative that Grover and Caitlin Chafee and Janet and CRMC staff have been involved with. And this is also an effort to sort of drive home what the next steps can be for engineering with nature and the natural nature-based solutions. Do you want to add anything to that, Janet or Tiffany? No? Okay. Grover just stepped out. Okay, great. Are there any other questions before we wrap things up? Well, I thank you for your attention through this. We look forward to having your comments on chapters 6 and 7. We've given you some good evening reading to go home and download, so enjoy it. And just feel free to let us know if you have any questions or comments moving forward. Thank you very much. Thank you all at home. Good night.